Welcome back. This is the next part. We'll talk about the reward system in the brain, and that's exactly what I'm showing here. So let's go over this slide real quick. So we have here, these are three important areas that we should know about when we talk about the reward system, and this is something we'll be talking about in the lectures quite a bit. So this system is a fundamental system that has been identified by neuroeconomics. And what we have here is the ventral tegmental area, which is at the top part of the brain stem, and that contains dopaminergic neurons. So neurons that use dopamine to communicate with each other at the synaptic level. These neurons project to the nucleus accumbens and also the ventral striatum, as you can see here. So this is the caudate nucleus, which we'll also talk a lot about, especially the ventral part of the caudate nucleus. This is the nucleus accumbens, and then further on to the prefrontal cortex, especially this chunk here, which we learn about as either the orbitofrontal cortex or the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So this system has become very important in neuroeconomics, and it's also even, well, we know now that it processes value. So subjective value is processed within this system in a manner that the system seems to be tracking how much value a stimulus or an action has to the participant across different tasks, in fact. So this is a summary analysis, or that's called a meta-analysis, across 206 studies by Batra et al. That was conducted in 2013. What they're showing is regions that correlate with subjective value in different tasks, which we'll talk about in a second, but also continue to talk about throughout the lectures. And we see activation in ventral striatum here. We see activation in anterior cingulate cortex. But we want to really look at this slide where positive rewards are greater than negative or effects of rewards. So this is increased activity in this region as rewards or subjective value increases. Again, we have ventral striatum here, quite a large cluster, and then we have ventromedial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex here. So these are important regions responsible for encoding or increasing the activation patterns, ramping up the activation as the subjective value of something increases, just like in the Tremblay and Schulz paper from the previous lecture, or from the previous video. Here's the reward system again depicted sort of not as nice as before, but the point is that we can look at each of these regions and we can find evidence for involvement of these regions across different studies. So here's one of the, here are a number of studies. The first one showing that there is this parametric increase from a least preferred to a most preferred reward. And in this case, it's food rewards that were given in the scanner that we see in the ventral tegmental area. A study by Knudsen et al. Shows that in the nucleus accumbens we have a similar parametric increase when participants expect different magnitudes of values ranging from $5 to $0, and that is in this yellow area here. Then in the green area we have a study by Delgado et al. That shows a similar increase for small amounts relative to large amounts, and also rewards versus punishments. And finally, in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, we again show this increase of the magnitude, that basically an increase in bold signal as the magnitude of the reward increases from relatively low to relatively high. So let's talk about these studies in a bit more detail on the next slides. So here is the one that I showed you about the ventral tegmental area. In this basically reinforcement learning paradigm, participants learned to associate each of these cues with an outcome that was then delivered to them via syringe pump into the scanner. So you have a little hose in your mouth and then you taste what you're getting. Importantly, there were different juices that were rated before the study by the participants in terms of how well they tasted to the participants. So we had black currant juice, melon juice, grapefruit, carrot juice, and a tasteless control solution. And you get preference ratings like in many economics experiments before they go into the scanner then. And you can see that the activity in the ventral tegmental area basically correlates quite nicely with how subjects, the subjective value that subjects assign to each one of these juices. So least preferred juices lead to a decrease in activation, whereas most preferred juices lead to an increase in activation. And then the juices that people are relatively indifferent about lead to no change in activation. So showing basically that there's this parametric response with subjective value in the ventral tegmental area. Then looking at the nucleus accumbens, this is a very famous task now in neuroeconomics called the MID task, or the monetary incentive delay task. And it's also very simple again. So you have these stimuli that as a circle indicate that the subject is going to receive a gain outcome, and as a square that the subject is going to receive a loss. But let's just look at the gain. 3 bars here means it's going to be a high gain if the subject is able to push a button within relatively fast within this period here, right? So it's a very simple task. You see this outcome, there's an anticipation period, you have to wait for 2 seconds, then there is some kind of delay. But when you see this cue, you have to press the button, just one button, very fast. And if you're fast enough, then you will receive the outcome. If you weren't fast enough, you will receive nothing. And this is told to you at the end, in the outcome period there. The researchers are mostly interested in the anticipation period. That is when the participants are most actively looking at the screen and making sure that they respond fast to the outcome. And during this period, what we see is, again, activation in the nucleus accumbens, part of this reward system that we talked about earlier, and this ramping up of activity as the anticipated outcome increases in size. So we have the highest activation for the $5 anticipated outcome, an intermediate activation for $1, and a low activation for $0.2 of activated outcome. And this is actually a task that has been used multiple times in multiple different contexts and has been replicated, which the authors Brian Knudsen and Stephanie Greer show in this meta-analysis here. So this is the nucleus accumbens here, anticipating basically different magnitudes of outcomes. So this is another study in this series of studies, in the series of early studies, showing an association between neurons in different parts of the reward system, or actually regions within the reward system, and increasing bold responses with increasing subjective value, or in this case, outcome value. And this is the subjects here, the authors here, used a reinforcement learning task where these sort of random stimuli are associated with different types of lotteries. And subjects then have to learn by trial and error to choose the correct one, the correct stimulus that leads to a higher outcome relative to one of these potential lower outcomes. So in each trial, there's a better stimulus and a worse stimulus. And the authors use these different ranges of lotteries that subjects could choose over, with some that both led to gains, 160 and 250. Let's say in this case, outcome range, and some that led to losses with an outcome range of between -600 and -425. So subjects then have to learn to pick the right stimulus that led to either higher or lower higher gains, but lower losses, basically. And what the authors found is that within the orbitofrontal cortex, the bold response nicely scales again with the magnitude of the outcome associated with a given stimulus. So losses lead to decreased activation in the bold signal, or percent signal change in the bold signal, whereas gains lead to an increased signal in the orbitofrontal cortex. Again, important here is this sort of scaling of the bolt signal to the actual value of the outcome, which relates directly the bolt signal to the subjective value that the subject is experiencing. Now, it's also important to note that there are multiple different types of rewards, and it looks like the reward system doesn't necessarily distinguish between them, although there's evidence that it does. So we can have different types of rewards that have been shown to be processed, at least in the orbitofrontal cortex, but also in other areas of the reward system. So we have increased responses to food-type stimuli, especially during hunger compared to satiety, and that's in the lateral orbitofrontal cortex here. And you can see this here, the pleasantness ratings relate to the magnitude of the bolt response again. The bolt response is on the y-axis, and the pleasantness ratings are on the x-axis here. So the least pleasant leads to a decrease, the most pleasant leads to an increase. And we even have reward-like responses to attractive versus unattractive faces. Again, we're here in this medial orbitofrontal cortex region and the posterior cingulate cortex, which we had seen before. But this ventromedial prefrontal cortex area here is an important region. Now, a meta-analysis on all of these studies has been conducted. This is one by Clitheroe and Rangel, looking at different types of rewards and whether they're all processed in different regions. So we have monetary rewards, which most studies use. That's why we have more extensive activation clusters here. They're easy to use. You can just simply tell participants how much you're going to pay them, and they're easily scalable. So it's clear what the difference is between winning $0 versus winning $20, right? And you find this activation in ventral striatum and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Then when we use food rewards, it gets a bit more technically complicated, but that's considered a primary reward, whereas money not necessarily is considered a primary reward. So this is something that sustains us and therefore is something we need to work for. Again, we find these activations in ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And then there's other types of rewards, such as the faces that we had shown to you earlier. And maybe other stimuli, such as, let's say, pictures of attractive ladies that are not very well dressed. That has also been used in some studies. But the important thing is that between all of these different types of rewards, we see that there's significant overlap in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex across all the studies that had been included in this meta-analysis. So all in all, this has led to quite some knowledge about the reward system. We know that there's a number of regions that are involved in this, specifically the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex. And when it comes to fMRI studies, there's a lot of times some overlap between these regions, where some researchers call the same region OFC and others call it VMPFC. This is something I'll point out later as well. This here is the striatum. So we have multiple areas within the striatum. So the ventral part of the striatum here, and then going up to the more dorsal parts, and they connect to different areas within the brain. So they have stronger connections to different areas. Importantly, the ventral striatum is connected quite heavily with the VMPFC, and that's exactly the kind of activation patterns that we see when we use, for instance, monetary reward. This is the ventral striatum here in a different view, and this is the VMPFC here also in a different view. And then the origin of this entire system, the origin of the dopaminergic projections in substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area, as I've shown you before.